Hello everybody, Sanjay here. Wireless power transfer has been a long and dark road for a lot of people, but we saw light at the end of the tunnel and we have been learning from mistakes, preferably theirs. Here, for example, is the original patent on which Qi is based, a 2002 patent still assigned to Amway Corporation, by the way, and they make a fundamental double resonator mistake, basically like a radio frequency system, saying that if you tune both the receiver and transmitter to 100 kilohertz, you get the maximum power. Big mistake. In reality, the resonant peak is not fixed at 100 but can even move to 140 kilohertz for a coupling of 0.5. There are some archived white papers from the Wireless Power Consortium behind Qi saying basically the same thing. That it's something similar to resonating strings, which is a completely false analogy. And if you tune both of them to the same frequency, basically they go out of the picture. Strings are a very weakly coupled system. Qi is not. And the spiral coil and spiral coil structure, so ubiquitous in wireless power transfer, is known to enhance coupling. In the case of Qi, it goes from zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.7, which is roughly 1,000 times more than a string analogy. And it has some other problems too. Alignment. So only when it's carefully aligned, you get a good linkage, and it's not. You have the familiar alignment anxiety of Qi. Does it sound familiar to you? So this is apparently what happened. Qi first started with an invalid assumption of double resonators, which is really not applicable here. And then they added to that the spiral coil, and two coils of roughly the same size, which are very alignment sensitive, unfortunately. So two mistakes. And let's not forget what Steve Jobs said. When you make a mistake, it's best to admit it and move on quickly. Learn from it. We did that, they didn't. And perhaps just to save face, then they created the myth of poor user experience of inductive systems as compared to resonant systems, which we'll talk about. And they repeated this so many times that probably the whole world believes it by now, and it's not true. But if you repeat it, people feel it's true. The so-called competing resonance standard they were comparing to inadvertently had things quite okay because they had used a frequency of 6.78 megahertz and ISM band, and they thought it gave them a free pass for EMI till they realized that for that they need a 0.2% tolerance, which was almost completely unachievable with ferrites and commercial capacitors. So what they did was they created very gigantic air core coils with distributed capacitance for the transmitter. And the receiver, a tiny coil placed on top of that huge transmitter coil, basically became a very weakly coupled system, and so the double resonator approach kind of applied. And plus you had a big transmitting surface and a very small receiver, and you could move that receiver around for so-called good user experience. That's what happened. In other words, the good user experience of so-called resonant systems became true kind of inadvertently, and had Qi used such big air core coils, they too would have had good user experience. It had nothing to do with anything else. Resonance guys could tune both to the same frequency and kind of get away with it. I had posted a video on March 28, 2019 saying roughly the same thing, that all these things were true, that they couldn't use ferrites and commercial capacitors, and they used big coils and so on and so forth. But there was another statement I made there, that they had requested keep ferrites and metals away from the coils because it caused a huge frequency shift of its own. So no metal casings were allowed around a resonance transmitter. And what happens is, what you didn't see, the flux bombarding you on your face and thighs, and you would fail any FCC safety SAR test. So good user experience, yes, but for a very short time. Where's the user? Is he at the emergency room or the intensive care unit? You tell me. But things were looking really positive for A4WP resonance standard for a long time. Here's an article from Engadget, which basically says designed by committee may not be a bad thing after all. It's a 2012 article. And what about designed by consortium, by the way? Have you ever thought about that? So now visually see what was happening. Here are the TI coils and the EPC coils. You note how big the transmitter coil is, how the electronics is always to the side, even on the receiver coil. This is the receiver on top of a huge transmitting surface. So you move it around, it's a weakly coupled system. The receiver doesn't affect the transmitter. And yeah, voila, it's a good user experience. And resonance was therefore considered to be the outright winner. And Chi, which was already experiencing alignment issues and so on for reasons which they had not identified, was supposed to be kind of maybe we'll move along. And then this happened. The inability of Resonance to get FCC approval suddenly came to the fore, and everything changed almost overnight. Resonance died, and Chi, which despite all its problems, managed to get FCC approval, kind of lingered on. And alignment anxiety, well, FCC doesn't consider that dangerous to your health. It lingered on. But she also had some other problems not clearly disclosed. For example, a very hot coil pressed against the battery will reduce the life of the battery to at least half. And also, the battery electronics will jump in to protect the battery and try to reduce the power, which eventually comes down to about 3.5 watts. Yes, as measured by independent test labs today. But did you know that? Now compare it to ours. We have a really tiny coil. It's not demanding any geometry on the part of the receiver, and it's positioned away from the battery. And you can have a predominantly metal casing too. There's no heat trap here. The battery life is not halved. Here is a fairly well-known blog from a former vice president of UBeam who talks about Qi, and he says that they have an interoperability nightmare. Exact words. You click on it, and it takes you to DigiKey to show you a table from Worth Electronics, a magnetic supplier, where they basically show you that their transmitter coils and receiver coils, so-called for Qi, don't work with each other. This was the same diagram that I had published under the Qi Interoperability Nightmare article in 2017. So, bottom line is Qi is simply a badly designed resonant system. In other words, Qi was not an inductive system with some inherent user experience problem. It was just a badly designed resonant system. But this distinction between the two gave people to preach a resonant extension to Qi without realizing the fundamental problems. And it gave an opportunity which WPC also joined up with, preaching that they were coming up since a long time with a resonant standard. I think the idea was to get Apple to bite on it, which they did. The CEO, CTO of Power by Proxy had been saying for a very long time that they had a resonant extension already tested, ready to go, backward compatible. And this video in which I talked about it was actually posted 12 hours before Apple announced that AirPower was cancelled. How did I know? All this time, we at Chargers were carving out the only path available through a performance and regulatory minefield. We corrected the underlying physics. We have very smart firmware which adapts to the moving resonant peak. We changed the magnetic so that the receiver is not geometry sensitive. We introduced the world's smartest FOD requiring no communication at all. And we also ensured better than backward Qi compatibility. I stress better than. So for example, see our videos. This is a variable charging sideways on a standard Qi transmitter. They can't do it. We did it 18 months ago, and these are two dual Qi right next to each other with no crosstalk, no interference. We have a video showing this too. And a coin is detected right away with no communication. Obviously, a coin does not communicate. World's smartest FOD. And we delivered huge amounts of power. They were like struggling to get to 15 watts or 5 watts or 3.5, whatever it is. We have awesome amounts of power with a receiver coil which barely gets hot. So this is roughly how we did it. It's in a slide in one of our presentations, and a lot of text is there. You can slow it down and have a look at it. But one of the important things is our transmitter structure is essentially zero EMI. Our magnetics is alignment friendly because the flux lines tend to follow the movement of the receiver coil. And you can parallel quite a few for far more power. So that is a very different way of looking at things. And here's a MathCAD simulation where we show that every time the receiver coil moves, you have a huge shift in the resonant frequency location and the gain profile. They don't even recognize the shift. We adapt to it every milliseconds. Resonance is tricky. Sorry to say that. And that's what we corrected. We learned from their mistakes.